Before we begin, if you're interested in the hidden infrastructure of Cold War espionage and the real human cost of intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We document these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the investigative truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about a storage locker that exposed a Soviet spy network and destroyed an American family. On the morning of March 18, 1981, at approximately 9:23 a.m., FBI Special Agent Thomas Riley stood in the parking lot of the Parkway Self-Storage Facility on Route 1 in College Park, Maryland, holding a federal search warrant and a pair of bolt cutters. The sky was overcast, with temperatures in the low 40s and a sharp wind that cut through his coat. Riley, 42 years old, had been assigned to the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterintelligence Division for 7 years. He had participated in dozens of searches of residences, vehicles, and offices belonging to suspected Soviet intelligence operatives. But this was the first time he had been assigned to search a storage locker. The warrant authorized the search of Unit 247, a 10 by 15-foot climate-controlled storage space rented under the name David Mitchell at the Parkway facility since October 1979. According to rental records obtained by subpoena, the monthly fee of $85 had been paid in cash, delivered in person by the renter on the first of each month, without fail. The facility's manager, a man named Carl Hendricks, had described David Mitchell as a quiet, polite man in his late 30s or early 40s who always wore sunglasses and a baseball cap and who never engaged in conversation beyond what was necessary to conduct the transaction. The FBI's interest in Unit 247 had begun 6 weeks earlier, on February 3, 1981. When surveillance teams following a known Soviet intelligence officer named Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov had observed him entering the Parkway self-storage facility and spending approximately 12 minutes inside before departing. Petrov, 44 years old, held the official position of cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The FBI assessed with high confidence that his actual role was as a case officer with the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for managing intelligence assets and supporting illegal operatives, Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States under false identities without diplomatic cover. Following Petrov's visit to the storage facility, FBI agents had obtained facility records and identified Unit 247 as the only unit Petrov could have accessed based on the timing and location of his movements within the building. Surveillance photographs taken from a van positioned across the street had captured Petrov entering the facility's main entrance at 2:47 p.m. and exiting at 2:59 p.m., carrying the same leather briefcase he had brought in, but walking with what agents described as a slightly different posture, as if the briefcase now weighed more or less than it had when he entered. The search warrant had been approved by U.S. District Judge Margaret Hollings 2 days earlier, on March 16. 1981. The FBI's application had outlined the surveillance of Petrov, the rental records for Unit 247, and the Bureau's assessment that the storage unit was likely being used to support Soviet intelligence operations within the United States. Judge Hollings had authorized the search and the seizure of any materials related to espionage, foreign intelligence activities, or violations of federal law. Riley was accompanied that morning by 3 other FBI agents, Daniel Costa, 38, who specialized in technical surveillance equipment, Jennifer Walsh, 31, who had expertise in document analysis and cryptography, and Michael Torres, 29, who served as the photographer responsible for documenting every step of the search. Also present was Carl Hendricks, the facility manager, who had been served with the warrant and instructed to provide access to Unit 247. The Parkway Self-Storage Facility was a single-story concrete building divided into approximately 200 individual units of varying sizes. Unit 247 was located in the building's northeast corner, accessible through an interior corridor. The facility had no security cameras, a common situation in 1981 before video surveillance became ubiquitous. Access to the building required a key to the main entrance and a separate padlock key for each individual unit. Hendricks explained that David Mitchell had been given 2 keys to his padlock when he rented the unit, and the facility maintained no master key or duplicate. At 9:31 a.m., the team entered the facility's main corridor. Torres began photographing immediately, documenting the approach to Unit 247. The corridor was dimly lit by overhead fluorescent fixtures, some of which flickered intermittently. The concrete floor was clean, but showed wear from years of rolling carts and moving equipment. The walls were painted an institutional beige. Unit 247's door was a roll-up metal panel secured by a heavy-duty master lock padlock. Riley examined the lock and the door for any signs of tampering or security devices. Finding none, he positioned the bolt cutters and, at 9:34 a.m., cut through the padlock's shackle with a sharp crack that echoed in the corridor. The lock fell to the floor. Riley grasped the door's handle and rolled it upward. What the agents found inside Unit 247 would provide the FBI with its most comprehensive view yet of how Soviet intelligence supported illegal operatives on American soil. The storage unit's interior was organized with a precision that immediately suggested careful planning and regular use. Against the back wall stood gray metal shelving units holding cardboard boxes, all of uniform size and appearance, each labeled with meaningless alphanumeric codes: BX-471, BX-472, BX-473, and so on. On the left wall stood a 4-drawer filing cabinet, also gray metal, with a small desk and folding chair beside it. On the desk sat a portable Smith Corona typewriter and a gooseneck lamp. The right wall held more shelving containing what appeared to be books, technical manuals, and binders. Torres began methodical photographic documentation from the doorway, capturing wide-angle shots showing the overall layout before moving to detailed images of specific items. Walsh began examining the boxes on the shelving units, while Costa focused on the filing cabinet and desk area. Riley supervised and took notes in a small, spiral-bound notebook, recording observations, timestamps, and the location of items within the unit. The first box Walsh opened, labeled BX-471, contained approximately $32,000 in U.S. currency. The bills were used in various denominations, from 20s to 100s, bundled with rubber bands into stacks of $1,000 each. Walsh documented the contents, photographed the money, and moved to the next box. BX-472 contained another $28,000. BX-473 held $35,000. In total, 11 boxes on the shelves contained cash, totaling $347. 000, a sum equivalent to well over $1 million in 2024 purchasing power. The presence of such a large amount of cash in a storage locker rented under an alias immediately suggested operational funding. Soviet intelligence officers working illegally in the United States required money for living expenses, equipment purchases, travel, and payments to assets. Traditional banking would create records and require identification that could compromise an illegal's cover identity. Cash allowed for anonymous transactions and left no paper trail. While Walsh continued examining the boxes, Costa opened the filing cabinet. The top drawer contained file folders organized alphabetically by what appeared to be code names or operational designations. Each folder held documents related to a specific identity or operation. One folder, labeled Auburn, contained a birth certificate for a man named Robert James Patterson, born in Duluth, Minnesota, in 1944. The birth certificate appeared genuine, with appropriate paper stock, printing quality, and official seals. However, records the FBI would later obtain from Minnesota, vital statistics offices showed that no Robert James Patterson matching these details had ever been born in Duluth. The folder also contained a Social Security card in Patterson's name, a Maryland driver's license showing a photograph of a man who bore no resemblance to Viktor Petrov or any other known Soviet intelligence officer, and several credit cards in Patterson's name from major banks. These documents represented what intelligence professionals call a legend, a complete false identity built using genuine or expertly forged documents, designed to allow an operative to function in society without arousing suspicion. The second drawer contained similar folders for other identities: Cardinal, Delta, and Echo. Each folder contained the same types of documents: birth certificates, Social Security cards, driver's licenses, credit cards, and in some cases, library cards, gym memberships, and other minor documents that added depth and authenticity to the false identity. The third drawer held technical equipment manuals. Costa, who had specialized training in surveillance and communications devices, recognized several of the manuals as relating to shortwave radio equipment, encrypted communications systems, and photography equipment designed for document reproduction. One manual, printed in Russian with handwritten English translations in the margins, described the operation of a burst transmission radio system, technology that allowed coded messages to be transmitted in extremely brief, high-speed bursts that were difficult to detect and intercept. The fourth drawer contained operational planning documents. These included hand-drawn maps of various locations throughout the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, with specific sites marked and annotated in handwriting that combined English words with Cyrillic characters. Some locations were public parks, others were shopping centers, restaurants, or office buildings. Next to each marked location were notes indicating dates and times, suggesting these were meeting sites or dead-drop locations used for exchanging information or materials. On the desk beneath the typewriter, Walsh found several sheets of carbon paper and a stack of onion skin typing paper, thin, translucent paper, often used for making multiple copies of typed documents. The typewriter itself appeared well used, with wear visible on frequently struck keys. Examination of the typewriter's ribbon would later reveal faint impressions of previously typed text, though the quality was too poor to reconstruct complete messages. The desk's single drawer contained more operational materials, a collection of maps showing various U.S. cities including New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. A box of microdot readers, devices used to view extremely small photographs embedded in seemingly innocent documents. And several rolls of undeveloped 35mm film in unmarked canisters. On the shelving units along the right wall, Costa discovered technical equipment that confirmed the unit's use for intelligence operations. One shelf held 2 shortwave radio receivers, both manufactured by companies known for producing equipment favored by intelligence services for their reliability and capability to receive transmissions from long distances. Next to the radios were several notebooks containing what appeared to be number sequences and transmission schedules, the kind of information needed to receive and decode encrypted numbers, station broadcasts that Soviet intelligence used to communicate with operatives in the field. Another shelf contained photographic equipment, two 35mm cameras, one Nikon and one Minolta, both with specialized lenses suitable for document photography. A portable document stand with lighting designed for copying papers, and several boxes of high-contrast film optimized for reproducing text and diagrams. This equipment represented a complete document photography setup, allowing an operative to photograph classified materials quickly and efficiently, producing copies that could be transmitted to Moscow or passed to handlers. Perhaps most significant was what Costa found on the bottom shelf: a large metal case, approximately 2 feet wide by 3 feet long by 1 foot deep, secured with a combination lock. The case was heavy, and when Costa lifted it, something inside shifted with a mechanical sound. Rather than attempting to open the case immediately, Riley made the decision to transport it intact to the FBI's Washington field office, where it could be examined under controlled conditions and photographed throughout the opening process. By 11:47 a.m., after more than 2 hours of careful documentation, the agents had catalogued the contents of Unit 247. The inventory included $347,000 in U.S. currency, complete false identity packages for at least 12 different individuals, 2 shortwave radio receivers, document photography equipment, including cameras, specialized lighting, and film, microdot readers, and materials, operational planning documents including maps, schedules, and coded notes, technical manuals for communications and surveillance equipment, the locked metal case, and miscellaneous operational materials including disguise items such as wigs, glasses, and clothing, tools for lockpicking, and chemical materials whose purpose was not immediately apparent. The agents carefully packed everything into evidence boxes, maintaining meticulous chain of custody documentation. Each item was photographed in place before being moved, then photographed again after being packed. Torres shot more than 300 photographs during the search, creating a comprehensive visual record of the unit's contents and their locations. At 12:15 p.m., the agents began transporting the evidence boxes to their vehicles. Carl Hendricks, the facility manager, watched the process with evident bewilderment. He later told FBI investigators that he had assumed David Mitchell was storing ordinary household items or perhaps business inventory. The presence of so much cash and suspicious equipment shocked him. He provided the FBI with copies of all rental records for Unit 247 and agreed to notify agents immediately if anyone attempted to access the unit. The search of Unit 247 represented a significant intelligence coup, but it also raised urgent questions. Who was David Mitchell? Was he an illegal Soviet operative living under this false identity, or was David Mitchell simply a cover name used by various KGB officers to access the storage unit? What operations were being supported with the materials stored there? How many Soviet illegals were operating in the United States with the support of this infrastructure? And most pressing, how should the FBI proceed without alerting Soviet intelligence that their storage facility had been compromised? Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov, the Soviet cultural attaché whose visit to the storage facility had triggered the FBI's investigation, had been under surveillance by the Bureau's Washington field office since his arrival in the United States in September 1978. His diplomatic file listed his responsibilities as coordinating educational and cultural exchanges between Soviet and American institutions, organizing visits by Soviet cultural delegations, and facilitating cooperation between Soviet and American artists and performers. The FBI's assessment, based on signals intelligence, observed behavioral patterns, and information from defectors and other sources was that Petrov's actual role was significantly different from his official position. He was believed to be a KGB officer, assigned to manage illegal operatives, the most sensitive and closely guarded category of Soviet intelligence officers. Unlike legal operatives who worked under diplomatic cover and enjoyed immunity from prosecution, illegals operated under false identities with no connection to Soviet diplomatic or commercial establishments. If caught, they could be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. For this reason, illegals required extensive support from the KGB, including false identity documents, secure communications, funding, and emergency extraction plans. Petrov's movements throughout his time in Washington had been carefully documented by FBI surveillance teams. He lived in a two-bedroom apartment in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood, drove a government-issued sedan, and maintained what appeared to be a modest social life centered around other Soviet embassy personnel and Washington's cultural community. He attended concerts, art exhibitions, and theater performances. He gave occasional speeches to academic groups about Soviet culture and the importance of U.S.-Soviet cultural exchange. But beneath this seemingly unremarkable routine, FBI analysts had identified patterns suggesting Petrov was engaged in operational activities. He made frequent trips to various locations throughout the Washington metropolitan area, often with no apparent purpose related to his official duties. He used what surveillance teams recognized as standard counter-surveillance techniques, taking circuitous routes, making sudden turns, entering buildings through one entrance and exiting through another, stopping abruptly as if he had forgotten something and turning around. These behaviors suggested he was checking for surveillance before conducting operational activities. The FBI had documented 17 separate instances over the previous 18 months in which Petrov had engaged in what appeared to be dead drop operations or meetings with unidentified individuals in locations such as public parks, shopping malls, and restaurants. In each case, surveillance teams had observed behavior consistent with intelligence tradecraft, arriving early to check the location, positioning himself to observe approaches, brief interactions or exchanges with other individuals, departing via circuitous routes. The discovery of Unit 247's contents provided crucial context for understanding Petrov's activities. The false identity documents, cash, and technical equipment suggested he was supporting multiple illegal operatives who were living and working in the United States under deep cover. The storage unit served as a secure location where operational materials could be stored and accessed as needed, without risk of compromise through searches of diplomatic facilities or personal residences. Following the search of Unit 247, the FBI faced a strategic decision. The Bureau could arrest Petrov and charge him with espionage-related offenses, but his diplomatic status complicated this approach. Under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, diplomatic personnel enjoy immunity from arrest and prosecution. The strongest action the U.S. government could take against a diplomat engaged in intelligence activities was to declare him persona non grata and expel him from the country. However, expelling Petrov would immediately alert Soviet intelligence that Unit 247 had been compromised, potentially causing other illegals to flee or destroy evidence. The alternative approach was to maintain surveillance of the storage unit and wait to see who else might access it. If other Soviet operatives visited Unit 247, the FBI could identify them and potentially map a broader intelligence network. This approach carried risks. If the Soviets detected the FBI's surveillance or independently decided to abandon the unit, the opportunity would be lost, but it offered the possibility of greater intelligence gains. FBI Director William Webster, after consulting with senior counterintelligence officials and with the State Department, approved the surveillance approach. Beginning on March 19, 1981, one day after the search of Unit 247, the FBI established continuous surveillance of the Parkway self-storage facility. Agents in rotating shifts monitored the entrance 24 hours a day from a rented apartment across the street that provided clear line of sight to the facility's parking lot and main entrance. Additional agents were positioned to follow anyone who accessed the building. The surveillance operation, given the code name Warehouse, involved more than 30 agents working in shifts. The FBI also installed technical surveillance, including a motion-activated camera hidden in the storage facility's corridor that would photograph anyone approaching Unit 247. The camera was concealed inside what appeared to be an ordinary fire extinguisher mounted on the wall approximately 15 feet from the unit's door. For the first week of surveillance, no one accessed Unit 247. The motion-activated camera photographed facility employees, customers visiting other units, and Carl Hendricks making his rounds. But no one approached the compromised storage unit. FBI analysts began to consider the possibility that Petrov's visit on February 3rd had been the last scheduled access and that the next visit might not occur for weeks or months. Then, on March 27, 1981, around 3:17 p.m., surveillance agents observed a man entering the Parkway self-storage facility. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with dark hair and a medium build. He wore a brown leather jacket, blue jeans, and white sneakers. He carried a small gym bag and wore sunglasses despite the overcast weather. The man entered the facility's main entrance and walked directly to Unit 247. The motion-activated camera captured clear images of his face as he approached the door. He stopped when he saw that the padlock was missing. The FBI had replaced the cut lock with a new one that appeared similar, but was not the original. The man examined the new lock for approximately 30 seconds, then looked up and down the corridor. His body language, according to agents watching video feeds in real time, suggested confusion and concern. After another moment of hesitation, the man turned and walked quickly back toward the facility's exit. Surveillance agents watching from the apartment across the street radioed to mobile units, and 2 cars carrying 4 agents moved to follow the man as he left the facility, got into a dark blue Ford sedan parked in the lot, and drove away. The surveillance teams followed the man through College Park, maintaining what they termed a loose tail to avoid detection. The man drove to a gas station on Route 1, where he used a payphone for approximately 3 minutes. He then drove to a shopping center in nearby Greenbelt, parked, and entered a supermarket. Agents observed him inside the store, apparently doing routine grocery shopping, selecting items, and placing them in a cart. After roughly 20 minutes in the supermarket, the man checked out, loaded his groceries into his car, and drove to a residential neighborhood in Silver Spring, Maryland. He pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story colonial house on Elm Street. He carried his groceries and the gym bag he had taken to the storage facility into the house and did not emerge again that evening. Property records obtained by the FBI that same day revealed that the house on Elm Street was owned by David and Susan Harris. David Harris, employment records showed, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized consulting firm in Bethesda. Susan Harris was a part-time elementary school teacher. They had purchased the house in 1976. They had 2 children, both under 10 years old. On paper, they appeared to be an ordinary suburban family. But the FBI now had reason to believe that David Harris was the man who had visited Unit 247, and that David Harris was not who he claimed to be. The investigation of David Harris began immediately. FBI agents conducted background checks, credit histories, employment verification, and every other standard investigative procedure used to confirm someone's identity. What they found was a carefully constructed legend that appeared solid on the surface, but began to reveal inconsistencies under detailed scrutiny. David Harris's Social Security number had been issued in 1963 in Oregon, when he would have been approximately 16 years old. However, when FBI agents contacted the Oregon Department of Motor Vehicles, they found no record of David Harris having received a driver's license in that state. His birth certificate from Portland, Oregon, appeared genuine and matched records at the city's Vital Statistics Office. But when agents attempted to locate Harris's supposed elementary school records, high school transcripts, or any other documentation of his childhood and education in Portland, they found nothing. The pattern suggested a common KGB technique for creating deep cover legends. Soviet intelligence would identify deceased Americans, particularly children who had died young, and use their genuine birth certificates and other identity documents as the foundation for false identities. A Soviet illegal could assume the dead child's identity, obtain legitimate documents using the birth certificate, and build an entire life around this stolen identity. Because the real person was dead and had left few traces, there were no living relatives or extensive records that might contradict the false identity. FBI analysts cross-referenced David Harris's birth certificate information with death records and found that a child named David Robert Harris had indeed been born in Portland, Oregon, in 1947 and had died of pneumonia in 1952 at the age of 5. The KGB had taken this dead child's identity and used it to create a legend for what the FBI now believed was a Soviet illegal operative. Surveillance of the Harris residence intensified. Agents documented David's daily routines. He left for work each weekday morning around 7:30 a.m., drove to his accounting firm's office in Bethesda, worked a full day, and returned home near 6 p.m. Susan Harris took their children to school each morning and worked part-time at a local elementary school. On weekends, the family engaged in typical suburban activities: grocery shopping, yard work, trips to local parks, birthday parties with neighbors' children. The ordinariness of it all was precisely what made it effective tradecraft. Soviet illegals operating deep cover were trained to blend completely into American society, to become unremarkable in every way. To build lives that would draw no attention or suspicion, the Harris family appeared to have done exactly that. Neighbors interviewed later by FBI agents described them as pleasant, quiet, and entirely normal. They mowed their lawn, shoveled their driveway in winter, put up Christmas decorations, and waved to neighbors while getting their mail. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, the FBI believed David Harris was an intelligence officer conducting espionage operations against the United States. The challenge was proving it. Unlike Viktor Petrov, who had diplomatic status and whose activities could be documented and used to expel him, David Harris was living as an American citizen. If he was arrested and charged with espionage, the prosecution would need to present evidence in court that would reveal sources and methods the FBI preferred to keep secret. The evidence from Unit 247 was strong, but might not be sufficient for conviction if Harris's attorneys could create reasonable doubt about his connection to the storage unit. The FBI decided to continue surveillance while building a more comprehensive case. Over the following 6 weeks, from late March through early May 1981, agents documented David Harris's movements and activities. They obtained authorization for telephone wiretaps on the Harris residence and his office phone. They installed surveillance cameras covering the approaches to his house. They followed him whenever he left work during the day or went out in the evenings or on weekends. The surveillance revealed patterns that strengthened the FBI's suspicions. On several occasions, Harris made trips that deviated from his normal routines in ways that suggested operational activities. On April 8, 1981, instead of driving directly home from work, Harris drove to Rock Creek Park, walked along a trail for approximately 15 minutes, appeared to examine something near a particular tree, and then returned to his car and drove home. FBI agents who examined the tree afterward found a small cavity in the trunk that could have served as a dead drop, a hidden location for leaving or retrieving messages or materials. On April 22nd, Harris told his wife he was working late at the office. Instead of going to work, he drove to Alexandria, Virginia, parked near a shopping center, and walked to a nearby restaurant where he sat alone at a booth for approximately 30 minutes. FBI surveillance photographs showed him reading a newspaper. Shortly after 7:15 p.m., a man entered the restaurant, walked past Harris's booth, and appeared to drop something on the floor near the table. Harris reached down, picked up what appeared to be a folded piece of paper, and placed it in his pocket. The other man continued walking and exited the restaurant without looking back. Harris remained in the booth for another 10 minutes, then left and drove home. The FBI was unable to identify the man who had dropped the paper, but the interaction appeared to be a classic brush pass, a brief, seemingly accidental exchange used to transfer messages or materials between an operative and a handler or asset. The surveillance footage was clear enough to show the exchange, but not clear enough to identify the other man's face with certainty. Wiretaps of the Harris residence revealed little of operational significance. The family's telephone conversations consisted of routine domestic matters, Susan coordinating children's activities, David discussing work projects in general terms, calls to and from neighbors and family members. If Harris was communicating with Soviet intelligence, he was doing so through methods that left no trace on the home phone line. By early May 1981, the FBI had accumulated substantial evidence suggesting David Harris was a Soviet illegal. His false identity based on a deceased child, his visit to the compromised storage unit, his operational activities including dead drops and brush passes, and his consistent use of tradecraft and counter-surveillance techniques. But the Bureau still lacked direct evidence of espionage. Stolen classified information, payments from Soviet intelligence, or communications with Moscow. The decision was made to attempt to recruit Harris as a double agent. On May 14, 1981, FBI agents approached David Harris in a parking garage near his office in Bethesda. 4 agents blocked his path to his car, identified themselves, and requested that he come with them to have a conversation. The agent's report noted that Harris appeared startled but not entirely surprised. He asked what the conversation would be about, and when told it concerned his work for Soviet intelligence, he said quietly, "I'd like to speak with an attorney." The FBI had anticipated this response. The agents explained that Harris was not under arrest and was free to leave, but that they believed it would be in his interest to hear what they had to say. After approximately 30 seconds of silence, Harris agreed to go with the agents to a nearby FBI office. The interrogation of David Harris lasted more than 6 hours, from roughly 4:30 p.m. on May 14th until nearly 11 p.m. The sessions were conducted by two experienced FBI counterintelligence agents, Robert Kellerman and Patricia Zhou, both of whom had extensive training in interrogation techniques and psychological assessment. Harris was offered food, water, and bathroom breaks. He was reminded repeatedly that he was free to leave at any time and to request an attorney at any point. Interrogation logs later filed in court records show that Harris initially denied any involvement with Soviet intelligence. He claimed to be exactly who his identity documents said he was: David Harris, born in Portland, Oregon, employed as an accountant, married with 2 children, living an ordinary American life. He acknowledged visiting the Parkway self-storage facility on March 27th, but claimed he had rented a unit there under a different name. He refused to specify which name, to store some business documents, and had been surprised to find the lock changed. The FBI agents presented evidence systematically. They showed Harris surveillance photographs of his visit to Unit 247. They described the contents found during the search of the storage unit, including the false identity documents, cash, and technical equipment. They outlined the discrepancies in his background, the lack of school records, the deceased child whose identity he had assumed, the operational patterns they had observed. They explained that they knew he was not David Harris, that they knew he was working for Soviet intelligence, and that they could prove it in court if necessary. Harris listened to all of this without visible emotion. When the agents finished presenting their evidence, he sat quietly for nearly 2 minutes before speaking. Then he said, "If what you're saying is true, what happens now?" This was the moment the FBI had hoped for, an opening to discuss cooperation. The agents explained that Harris faced serious charges if prosecuted: conspiracy to commit espionage, false identity fraud, violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and potentially other offenses that could result in decades in prison. However, they suggested, there might be alternatives if Harris was willing to provide information about Soviet intelligence operations and to consider working with the FBI. Harris asked what working with the FBI would involve. The agents outlined the possibility of becoming a double agent, continuing to operate as a Soviet illegal but now reporting to the FBI, providing information about Soviet intelligence requirements and operations, and potentially helping to identify other Soviet operatives. In exchange, Harris might avoid prosecution, receive financial support, and ultimately be allowed to remain in the United States under witness protection. Harris said he needed time to think. The agents gave him until the following morning to make a decision. They drove him back to his car with a warning that he was under surveillance and that any attempt to flee or to contact Soviet intelligence would result in immediate arrest. Harris nodded and drove home. Surveillance teams watched the Harris residence throughout the night. Close to midnight, agents observed Harris in his home office on the 2nd floor, visible through a partially open curtain. He appeared to be sitting at his desk, possibly writing or reading, for more than an hour. Susan Harris and the children appeared to have gone to bed at their normal times, unaware of what was happening. At 6:23 a.m. on May 15th, 1981, David Harris called the phone number the FBI agents had given him and said he was willing to meet again. The meeting was arranged for 9:00 a.m. at the same FBI office. During this second interrogation session, David Harris made a decision that would transform the FBI's understanding of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. He agreed to cooperate fully with the FBI's investigation. In exchange, he requested immunity from prosecution, protection for his family, and eventual relocation under witness protection. The FBI agreed to recommend these terms to federal prosecutors, though final approval would rest with the Department of Justice. Over the next 3 weeks, from mid-May through early June 1981, David Harris participated in extensive debriefing sessions with FBI counterintelligence agents. The information he provided was extraordinary in its scope and detail, offering insights into Soviet illegal operations that the FBI had never before obtained from such a high-level source. Harris's real name, he revealed, was Pavel Mikhailovich Sokolov. He had been born in 1943 in Leningrad and had been recruited by the KGB in 1965 while studying mathematics at Leningrad State University. His initial training had focused on cryptography and secure communications, but in 1968 he had been selected for the elite illegal program, a designation that meant he would be trained to operate in the West under deep cover for extended periods, potentially for his entire career. The training had lasted more than 3 years and had been exhaustive. Sokolov had studied English until he could speak with an American accent indistinguishable from a native speaker. He had been trained in American history, culture, customs, and current events. He had learned tradecraft techniques, dead drops, brush passes, surveillance detection, secure communications, document photography, and emergency procedures. He had been taught to develop and maintain cover identities, to blend into American society, to recruit and handle assets, and to operate independently with minimal contact with Soviet intelligence officers under diplomatic cover. In 1972, after completing his training, Sokolov had been given the identity of David Harris, the deceased Oregon child whose birth certificate had been obtained through KGB sources. He had been provided with supporting documentation, a detailed legend covering his supposed life history, and $40,000 in operating funds. He had entered the United States through Canada in July 1972, using a Canadian passport in a different false name, then had crossed into the United States and begun building his life as David Harris. His instructions had been to establish himself in the Washington, D.C. area to develop a plausible career that would give him access to government or defense-related information, to avoid drawing any attention to himself, and to wait for instructions from Moscow. He had moved to Silver Spring, found work as an accountant, a profession for which he had been trained and which gave him legitimate reasons to work with various clients, including some with government contracts, and had focused on becoming entirely ordinary. In 1974, he had married Susan Richardson, an American woman he had met at a community event. Sokolov told his debriefers that Susan had no knowledge of his real identity or his work for Soviet intelligence. He had married her as part of his cover, believing that a family life would make him seem more normal and less suspicious. He genuinely cared for Susan and their children, he said, even as he acknowledged the deception at the heart of their relationship. Throughout the 1970s, Sokolov had operated as what intelligence professionals call a sleeper, an illegal operative who maintains cover and builds a life while waiting for activation. He had received instructions periodically through various methods: coded messages broadcast on shortwave radio, dead drops in public locations, and occasional meetings with KGB officers under diplomatic cover, such as Viktor Petrov. The storage unit at Parkway Self-Storage, Sokolov explained, was one of several such facilities maintained by the KGB throughout the United States to support illegal operations. The unit served as a cache for operational materials, money, documents, equipment that could be accessed by multiple operatives as needed. Sokolov had visited the unit perhaps a dozen times over the previous 2 years, usually to retrieve cash for living expenses or to collect documents and equipment for specific operations. His actual intelligence activities, Sokolov acknowledged, had been relatively limited. He had provided information about several of his accounting clients, including a small defense contractor working on radar systems and a government consulting firm with Pentagon contracts. He had photographed documents relating to these contracts and had passed the film to Soviet handlers through dead drops. He estimated that he had provided perhaps 20 to 30 documents over 8 years. Significant intelligence, certainly, but not the constant stream of classified material that characterized some espionage cases. The FBI's damage assessment, conducted over the following months, concluded that Sokolov's espionage had compromised several defense-related projects, but had not caused catastrophic harm to national security. The information he had provided was classified, but it was largely technical and had limited strategic value. The greater significance of his case was what it revealed about Soviet illegal operations, the long-term nature of the program, the extensive resources devoted to supporting illegals, the patience and planning involved in building deep-cover legends. Sokolov's cooperation also allowed the FBI to identify other Soviet operatives and support structures. He provided information about additional storage facilities used by the KGB, about communication protocols and dead drop locations, about the tradecraft techniques taught in illegal training programs, and about the organizational structure that supported illegal operations within the KGB's First Chief Directorate. Based on Sokolov's information, the FBI conducted searches of 2 other storage facilities in the Washington area, one in Virginia and one in Maryland. Both contained materials similar to what had been found in Unit 247: cash, false identity documents, communications equipment, and operational supplies. These discoveries suggested the scope of Soviet illegal support infrastructure in the United States was more extensive than the FBI had previously understood. Sokolov also identified Viktor Petrov as his primary KGB contact in the Washington area and described their operational relationship in detail. This information was used to build a case for Petrov's expulsion from the United States. On June 23, 1981, the State Department formally declared Petrov persona non grata, citing his involvement in intelligence activities incompatible with his diplomatic status. Petrov left the United States on June 28 and returned to Moscow. The question of what to do with Sokolov and his family proved complex. He had provided valuable cooperation and intelligence, but he had also committed serious crimes, including espionage against the United States. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia carefully reviewed the case and ultimately agreed to offer Sokolov immunity from prosecution in exchange for his continued cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence investigations. But immunity from prosecution did not solve the fundamental problem. Sokolov's cover as David Harris had been irretrievably compromised. He could not continue living in Silver Spring under his false identity. Soviet intelligence knew, or would soon know, that he had been caught and had likely cooperated with the FBI. His life and his family's lives were potentially in danger from Soviet retaliation. The FBI's Witness Security Program, commonly known as WITSEC, was designed to protect witnesses whose testimony put them at risk. Sokolov qualified for the program based on his cooperation with the FBI's investigation of Soviet intelligence operations. In July 1981, arrangements were made to relocate Sokolov and his family to a new location under new identities. This created a profound dilemma regarding Susan Harris and their 2 children. Susan still did not know the truth about her husband's identity or his work for Soviet intelligence. As far as she knew, David was an accountant who had somehow gotten into unspecified legal trouble that required the family to enter witness protection. The children, ages 7 and 9, were even less aware of the reality of their situation. FBI agents and WITSEC officials debated whether Susan should be informed of the full truth. Arguments in favor included the basic principle that she deserved to know whom she had married and that full disclosure might be necessary if she was questioned as part of the investigation. Arguments against included the assessment that telling her would only cause pain and that revealing the truth might cause her to refuse to cooperate with relocation, leaving her and the children vulnerable. The decision was made to provide Susan with a limited version of the truth. In a carefully structured conversation in late July 1981, FBI agents informed her that her husband had been involved in providing information to a foreign government and had cooperated with authorities in exchange for immunity and protection. The agents emphasized that Susan herself was not suspected of any wrongdoing and that her cooperation with the relocation process would ensure her family's safety. Susan's reaction, the agent's report noted, was shock, disbelief, and anger. She had difficulty accepting that the man she had been married to for 7 years, with whom she had built a life and raised 2 children, had been living under a false identity. She asked repeatedly whether David was really who he said he was, whether anything about their relationship had been real, whether he had ever actually loved her. The agents could provide no satisfying answers to these questions. The conversation lasted several hours. At the end, Susan agreed to participate in the relocation process, stating that her primary concern was the safety and well-being of her children. She insisted on 2 conditions: that the FBI arrange for her to speak privately with a counselor about what she had learned, and that her children not be told the full truth about their father until they were old enough to understand. In August 1981, the Sokolov/Harris family was relocated to a city in the Pacific Northwest under new identities. The specifics of their location and new names remain classified. WITSEC program records show the family was provided with a modest house, financial support during the transition period, and assistance in finding employment and schools for the children. The adjustment was difficult for everyone involved. Sokolov later told FBI debriefers that he struggled with guilt about the deception he had perpetrated on his wife and children. Susan struggled with the betrayal she felt and with the challenge of building a new life in a new place while processing the collapse of everything she had believed about her marriage. The children, confused by the sudden move and the changes in their lives, adapted as children do but carried scars from the disruption. FBI contact with the family continued for several years as Sokolov provided ongoing consultation on counterintelligence matters and as WITSEC officials monitored the family's security. Gradually, contact became less frequent. By the mid-1980s, Sokolov was no longer actively involved in FBI operations and was attempting to live a normal life under his new identity. The case's impact extended beyond the Sokolov family. The discoveries at the storage facilities and the information Sokolov provided led to a comprehensive review of FBI counterintelligence procedures and a renewed focus on identifying and monitoring Soviet illegals operating in the United States. The Bureau implemented enhanced background verification procedures for individuals working in sensitive positions, increased surveillance of locations identified as potential dead drop sites, and developed new technical methods for detecting illegal communications. The Department of Defense conducted a damage assessment to determine what classified information Sokolov had compromised during his years as an intelligence operative. The assessment concluded that while the information was significant, most of it related to programs that were either completed or had evolved to the point where the intelligence Sokolov had provided was no longer current. The strategic impact was assessed as moderate, serious, but not catastrophic. Soviet intelligence's response to the exposure of the storage facilities and Sokolov's cooperation was to abandon or modify their illegal support structures in the United States. The KGB recalled several known officers, including some who had not been directly implicated in the case, but were assumed to be at risk of exposure. The illegal program itself continued, but with modifications to operational security designed to prevent similar compromises. For the FBI agents involved in the case, it represented a significant success, but also revealed how difficult it was to detect and counter Soviet illegal operations. Thomas Riley, who had conducted the initial search of Unit 247, later reflected in an interview after his retirement that the case had demonstrated both the FBI's capabilities and the limitations of counterintelligence work. "We found one storage unit, one illegal, one small piece of a much larger operation," he said, "and it took years of surveillance, enormous resources, and a significant amount of luck. How many other illegals were out there that we never found? We'll probably never know." The storage facilities themselves were eventually closed. The Parkway Self-Storage Facility in College Park continued operating as a commercial business with no public acknowledgement of its role in a Soviet intelligence operation. The units in Virginia and Maryland were similarly returned to their normal functions. The contents seized during the searches became classified evidence, stored in FBI facilities and used for training and reference. Susan Sokolov, as she had been known, eventually divorced her husband in the late 1980s. Sealed court records obtained years later by researchers show she reverted to her maiden name, her actual maiden name, not a WITSEC-assigned identity, and moved to yet another city to start over. The children, by then teenagers, were given the option of maintaining contact with their father or not. Sources familiar with the case indicate that both children chose limited contact, struggling to reconcile their childhood memories of a loving father with the knowledge that much of their early life had been built on deception. Pavel Sokolov lived into the 2000s under his WITSEC-assigned identity. He worked in various occupations, none connected to government or classified information. He maintained periodic contact with the FBI, providing occasional consultations on Russian intelligence matters when requested. He lived alone, having lost his family through the consequences of his choices decades earlier. In a debriefing session conducted in 1995, more than a decade after his cooperation with the FBI had ended, Sokolov was asked whether he believed his work for Soviet intelligence had been worthwhile. The session transcript shows he was silent for a long time before answering. Then he said that he had believed at the time he was serving his country and contributing to the Soviet Union's security and interests. But looking back, he said, he could not identify any significant outcome that justified the destruction of his family and the betrayal of people who had trusted him. He was asked what he would say to Susan and his children if he could speak to them honestly. He said he would tell them that he had genuinely loved them, despite the deception, and that his greatest regret was not the espionage itself, but the choice to build a family while living a lie. He said he had convinced himself that he could compartmentalize his operational life from his family life, that he could be both a Soviet intelligence officer and a good husband and father. He had been wrong. The children, now adults, have lived their lives far from the shadows of their father's espionage career. Follow-up reports compiled by researchers in the 2000s indicate that both have families of their own, professional careers, and ordinary lives. Neither has spoken publicly about their father or about the experience of learning that their childhood had been built around a fiction. The impact of that knowledge is something they have carried privately. The case of Unit 247 and Pavel Sokolov represents a particular kind of Cold War story. one without clear heroes or villains, one in which people on all sides were operating according to the logic of systems that demanded deception, sacrifice, and the subordination of individual lives to larger ideological struggles. Sokolov was a Soviet intelligence officer who committed espionage against the United States. He was also a husband and father who built a life based on lies and ultimately lost that life when the lies were exposed. The FBI agents who investigated the case were doing their jobs, protecting national security, and they did so effectively and professionally. But their investigation also destroyed a family and traumatized children who bore no responsibility for their father's choices. Susan was a victim of deception who married a man she thought she knew and discovered she had been living with a stranger. The children were victims of circumstances they could not understand and choices they never made. The storage locker on Route 1 in College Park, Maryland, was just a physical space, 10 feet by 15 feet, climate-controlled, rented for $85 per month. But what it contained, and what its discovery revealed, resonated through multiple lives for decades. It represented the infrastructure of espionage, the patient and methodical work of intelligence services, building networks and supporting operations. It represented the intersection of grand strategy and intimate deception, where geopolitical competition played out in suburban storage facilities and ordinary lives were conscripted into secret wars. The photograph Thomas Riley took on March 18, 1981, showing the interior of Unit 247, with its shelves of cash and false identity documents, became an FBI training image, used to teach new counterintelligence agents about illegal support structures and operational tradecraft. To anyone unfamiliar with the context, the photograph showed an organized storage space with boxes, filing cabinets, and equipment. To those who understood what they were looking at, it showed the machinery of espionage, the hidden infrastructure that allowed foreign intelligence services to operate inside the United States. Pavel Sokolov was 38 years old when that photograph was taken, living as David Harris, working as an accountant, married with 2 young children, maintaining an elaborate fiction that would collapse within weeks. He was 67 when he died in 2010, having outlived the Soviet Union he had served, having lost the family he had built and deceived, having spent the last decades of his life in quiet obscurity under yet another false identity. Between those 2 points, the discovery of the storage unit and his death nearly 3 decades later, lay a lifetime of consequences flowing from choices made years earlier in the service of a state and a system that no longer existed. The question of whether his espionage mattered in any meaningful way is impossible to answer definitively. The documents he photographed and passed to Soviet intelligence were analyzed by Soviet military planners, but whether they influenced any specific decisions or outcomes is unknown. The larger Soviet illegal program, of which he was one small part, represented a significant investment of resources and personnel by the KGB. But how much actionable intelligence it produced, and how much it affected the course of the Cold War, remains a matter of debate among intelligence historians. What is certain is the human cost, measured not in strategic outcomes or intelligence coups, but in broken families, damaged children, lives lived under deception, and the unbridgeable gaps that open between people when fundamental truths are revealed to be lies. Susan believed she was married to an American accountant named David Harris, and she built a life on that foundation. When she learned the truth, that foundation collapsed, and everything built upon it, the marriage, the family, the sense of knowing and being known by another person, had to be reassessed and ultimately abandoned. The children believed their father was who he said he was, and then they learned he was not. and they had to reconstruct their understanding of their own childhoods and identities in light of that revelation. The process of learning that your life has been built partly on deception, that someone you loved and trusted was living a fundamental lie, leaves marks that don't heal completely. The storage locker was eventually re-rented to someone else who knew nothing of its history. The cash was catalogued as evidence and eventually forfeited to the government. The false identity documents were analyzed and archived. The technical equipment was studied and used to train FBI personnel in recognizing Soviet intelligence tradecraft. The operational plans and maps were cross-referenced with other intelligence and used to identify patterns and locations of Soviet intelligence activity. But the family that was destroyed by the discovery of that storage locker could not be catalogued, archived, or studied. The damage was personal, intimate, and permanent. And the question that haunts cases like this, whether the intelligence gained was worth the human cost, has no answer that satisfies, only different ways of framing the question and different perspectives from which to view the wreckage. The case of Unit 247 and Pavel Sokolov ended formally in 1981 with Sokolov's cooperation and relocation. But its consequences continued for decades, rippling through lives in ways that were impossible to predict or control. It ended in the way many Cold War espionage cases ended, with files closed, evidence archived, careers moved on, and people left to carry forward the weight of what had happened and what they had learned about the fragility of truth and trust.